I'd like to begin these sessions with a disclaimer, and that is I have never been an ED of a not-for-profit organization. However, I have served on 12 nonprofit boards and about 5 business boards. In addition, I have published articles and blog posts about nonprofit governance. If you have a day without doing anything, you can check my blog site, and it has over 450 posts on nonprofit governance and counting. As Cindy said, we'll welcome your questions at any time, and we also may have time at the end. I hope that in the next 60 minutes you'll find new ideas or corrective actions that you can apply to your organization tomorrow. We are covering 3 major topics. I say they're major topics because I have documented their importance through social media. First is what makes a great nonprofit board member. Second is that CEOs need to develop partnering relationships with board members. And third, common practices nonprofit boards need to avoid. So let's get started on, what makes a nonprofit board great? So what I have here are some unique suggestions, and when I say some unique suggestions, what I've done is to take some board material from the for-profit world and applied it to the nonprofit world. That's why I call it unique. In other words, we can learn from others. As the old Chinese saying says, the wise man learns from his own experience. The wiser man learns from the experience of others. And that's what we're attempting to do there. This is what makes it unique, and this is what makes this material seem so important to such a broad range of nonprofit people. Now, this section will be divided into 2 parts. One, how to select qualified persons, and second, signs that your board colleagues have moved into what I refer to as a go-along to get along nonprofit culture. And I will explain that in a little more detail as we move through. First, in terms of the selection, in the 21st century, we need to select for specific needs and backgrounds. In the past, nonprofits say, well, they need a lawyer. But what type of lawyer do you need? Do you need a lawyer who handles family issues? Then you should, if your organization has family issues, you ought to seek a lawyer who is competent in family law. Then you also need perhaps a physician, a minister, or even maybe a professor. For example, one nonprofit that I encountered had 50% of its revenues from 2 annual events. And they said to me, well, we need a marketing person. And I says, well, what type of marketing person do you need? Do you need a marketing research person? Do you need a marketing planning person? Do you need a marketing advertising person? And we finally came down to the issue that they really needed a marketing person who had done event planning. And they sought one, and it was a successful situation. You also, in the 21st century, need to look for more what we call soft skills. I don't like the term, but it's a common one that we're doing. And what soft skills are such as critical thinking and strategic planning, things that don't show in a resume, but the person is very, very good at it. And I'll talk more about that as we progress there. You need to have a person who can focus on the business model. And the business model, the thing that drives the business model are financial statements, which are actually the language of business. Now, many nonprofit directors, I have noted through my years here, literally have no idea about the function of fund accounting and how to read the financial statements that they receive monthly. One recently told me that despite 6 years board tenure at the nonprofit in which I now serve, he never understood the financials and the budget. Also, if you're going to focus on the business model, you also need to make sure you have one person on the board who is strong in accounting and finance backgrounds. Hopefully, this person will head an audit committee. But it's very important to check to see that you have an audit committee. About half of nonprofits don't have audit committees at all, according to the national data. Boards, you have to, in terms of selecting also for the next stage, the growth stage of the nonprofits. Boards, when you have a startup, get involved with operations. In other words, their hands are needed to conduct the business, the service of the organization. But if this continues as the board gets into a mature stage, it amounts to board being micromanagers. And this is a significant problem for many. In fact, it can be the default position as nonprofits grow. In other words, the boards maintain their hands in the operations when they should have their hands out. As a result, you get loaded agendas with distracting minutia that many volunteers love to discuss, such as the plans for the annual dinner dance and its menu. So you need to stay away from those types of things. You also need make sure in terms of as you grow is the need for visionary directors. These are persons who have strategic visions that go beyond the current environment. Finding such candidates will take a great deal of time and effort, and nonprofit practices need to go to that level in the 21st century in seeking candidates that may be available. So look for what you need rather than just take what's available and available through families, friends, and colleagues. Moving on with some of the unique suggestions that we have here. You also need, I would suggest, one or two nonprofit board members from allied fields. For instance, executive directors from allied fields. For example, if your not-for-profit centers on catering to heart diseases, they might have EDs who on the board from nonprofits leading cancer and thyroid not-for-profits. Now, this is a controversial suggestion because some see it as a conflict of interest. Some see it that an ED on your board will vote with the current CEO on all things. But I think this is a risk that you might take in seeking an executive director from an allied field. You need to serve for what they call the courage of convictions. And the courage of convictions are what's best for the nonprofit clients, not what's best for the staff or management. Some directors call for more active board discussions. One, for instance, in his frustrations, suggested to me he wanted to see board conflict, not that he hoped that the board members will physically fight with each other, but he was talking about the lack of active discussion in his board meetings, and I would say in many of the board meetings that I've attended. Now, many are very wary of all decisions being unanimous with just modest questions from board members. But if you're a dissenting director, you have one weapon, is the no vote when you are in the minority. If you feel that this is an important decision that's wrong, and you want to disassociate yourself from it legally, you should have a no vote recorded, and that no vote recorded in your name in the minutes. So as you have. This absolves you from those who have taken a minority position from legal liability should the actions become a failure. Well, let's continue with this area of unique suggestions and board members who may have abandoned their convictions. And what we're talking about is a position that people go along to get along position. For what first, what evidence supports such a position is present in nonprofits? And I offer these suggestions. They are not in the PowerPoints. Unlike a business board, the nonprofit director lacks a significant personal financial investment in its organization. Yes, there may be an emotional investment, but lacks a significant investment. Secondly, nonprofit boards members are people with short-term relationships. The median length of a nonprofit director in the United States is somewhere between 4 to 6 years. And of course, the nonprofit mission and operations are quite different from the career member boards, career experiences of many of us in the nonprofit area. For example, a banker serving on a hospital board can be helpful in a financial sense, but has to learn a great deal about the operations of the institution in just a very few hours a month that he spends on board business. So you're not getting a depth of you get a feel for the operations, but not really a depth of their strategy. Now, also, the probability of having a legal claim or a legal claim, a personal legal claim, or a reputation loss is very modest, and but it can be real if a board is not properly executed, has not properly executed its, and these are important words, its duty of care. For example, in 2015, the managers and 15 of the 17 directors of Leamington Homes in Pittsburgh were personally fined a total of $2.2 million for lack of care of the residents. It was a major cause for failure was a failure to respond to staff reports of lack of care and a lack of audit committee. The organization never even had an audit committee to check on such things. Of course, other board members that you encounter in a nonprofit organization might be friends, colleagues, and potential clients, and possibly even members. So the thought is, if you're working on a get along philosophy, which a lot of nonprofits boards operate on this matter, why offend them? Because you're close to them, you will work with them, and you don't want to vote against them. However, remember, a no vote is critical if you really feel that they're going down the wrong path. In the Leamington case, there are only 2 of 17 directors who were exempted from the levy that the IRS put on the board. Now, getting back to the PowerPoint, you will also find that nonprofits quite often select board chairs on the basis of their personalities and personal appearances. This, especially when you have a major donor who wants to become the chair of the board or wants to take the board in a particular direction. This creates a very tense situation for the board. So that's a issue that needs to be worked through. Also, you will find boards that are not properly operating, engaging a weak local CEO to avoid moving expenses. This is a penny wise and pound foolish move. You also, board has an obligation to develop bench strength among current employees. The board needs to invest in and fight for talent, an objective, I must report from my experience, that does not get much attention that it really deserves in nonprofits. Also, nonprofits are known for a lack of planning lack of succession planning. And this is rarely discussed, and it needs to be considered. And another thing that you see with these types of situations is the board acting as a rubber stamp to avoid unpleasant board discussions. And actually, nonprofits can exist for a long time with this rubber stamp board because it yields modest growth without challenging the nonprofit for years. In other words, it's a go along, get along. In addition, related to this is allowing the CEO to maintain the status quo instead of innovating. It's what I call mining the store type of management, and you see it quite frequently where the CEO has a nice personality, has 2 plans, his budget for maybe about a 2% growth, has a very good staff, but is not doing what he or she could do to really maximize the efforts of the board. And you see these all the time. Another is failing to react to small red flags that come by. This was emphasized in the Leamington situation, in that the staff were coming to the board with reports that the board just didn't react to. Now, you can't react to everything that comes from the board staff, because especially in a growth situation, the people who have been there a long time become unhappy with the new regime. But on the other hand, you need to be very careful to make sure you don't pass too many of these things by if they're really problems that could lead to others. And a good example of a board that passed, had small issues, was the CFO of the organization. Kept putting off getting put off giving the board a count of uncollectible clients. And he kept saying, well, I've been busy, I'll get to it. Finally, after about 7 or 8 months or even longer, he gave the report, he provided the report, and it showed that he was he was reporting some inactive accounts as active accounts. So you can imagine what that did to the balance sheet, and it literally blew the organization up. And as a result, the CFO lost his job, the CEO lost his job, and I understand in order to straighten it out, the agency had to bring in a group of forensic accountants who are very let me call them costly forensic accountants to straighten the situation out. So be careful that you don't pass over small issues that are symptoms of major types of reports there. So let me pause for a minute, and I don't know, are there any questions that have arisen, Cindy?
Yes, indeed there are. So
okay, great. I'm getting ready to go into the next section, but let's.
So we have a couple. So I'm going to read. Hold on, I got to scroll back up. Question from Chris: how do we encourage our executive director and the likes to embrace the power of the business model and strategic planning in order to enter a growth phase?
Okay, a lot depends on the board and the power the board wants to exercise. And I would say you have to have also, beside the board chair, you need to have 3 or 4 or 5 people who want to push the business model, okay? And they have to be people who are respected by the other board members. If you have that little cohort working together, you can develop success. I've done it myself. I've been involved with it, and I know what it's all about. But that small cohort of the board chair, and 3 or 4 other board members who are pushing for this change. Okay?
Thank you. One other one before we move on. If you've got a board who's passionate for the cause or the mission, but they don't quite have perhaps the skills needed, how do you kind of balance through that or work through that, or try to come up with board members who can actually have passion as well as the skills component that are needed?
I would say with difficulty. You need to have people with passion, but you have to understand some people will come on your board without the high level of passion that others have. For example, I was involved with an agency in which a board member, which engaged a board member who sold insurance. Now, he did sell some policies to the agency, but he was also very skilled in fund development, and he was a very successful fund developer. But I'm sure he had passion, but not the passion a lot of other people might have. So you have to compromise that passion that you're looking for skills that you're needed. He went on to become the board member of a large hospital nonprofit hospital organization, and raised millions and millions of dollars for them. In the meantime, he raised a lot of money for the agency that he and I belong to. Okay.
Yep, thank you. That's all for right now.
Okay, let's move on here. I'll change the... now, let's go into the second major topic that we're looking at, that CEOs need to develop partnering relationships with board members. I missed one point, and let me just add it in there. I strongly believe that the CEO and the board members have to develop a strong partner relationship for fundraising. In some instances, the board will delegate all the fundraising activity to the CEO, or in the other case, the CEO looks to the board to do all the fundraising. It has to be a mutual partnership that they work, in which they work and develop in which they develop a partnership. And I believe that as I begin looking at the PowerPoints, that the CEO cannot be looked at as as a servant. He should be looked at as a competent manager, as a person who can handle all the operational issues there. It's a different type of role. However, too many not-for-profit CEOs like to go around and say, yes, the board members are my bosses, and it places them in a servant role, and this perpetuates the whole thing for a long period of time. Now, there is a different role between the CEO and the board members, and any CEO who is a partner will understand what that differentiation is. And the partner and the boards need to work with the CEO to achieve the goals of the organizations and also the impacts of the organization. Now, impacts are a very important part of the picture in this day and age, and I'm sure that some of you are aware of the fact that foundations are asking agencies and nonprofits for what impacts did they develop. A lot of this has been highlighted by the famous Mark Zuckerberg's $100 million grant to the Newark school systems. He gave them $100 million and to do certain things. They received objectives, but on the other hand, the $100 million had no impact on the students of the Newark school system. So look for impacts, and I think you've got to, in this day and age, you've got to work to find it and to and to refine it. What you're looking for is not meeting objectives alone, but finding ways in which you can show impacts. And one of the other ways, if you want to look at it, is to use some imperfect metrics. Run small studies of your own and show that you are trying to measure those impacts that are very difficult to measure. Here, I think also, now this is where I get into a lot of trouble, I think the CEO ought to be a voting member of the board if it is permitted by state law. I don't see any conflict of interest there, and I'm sure any wise CEO will, if he has any sense, will recuse himself from anything that would be smell of conflict of interest. Now, on the other hand, the partners need to understand each other as individuals, because currently overcrowded meeting agendas and time-compressed lifestyles don't allow people to have this time. So it has to be created in it. And the lack of connection is a real deficit for internal relationships. For example, just last week, the Board Source released this part of a study about it. And I'm quoting, this is a quote I'm taking from it, listen to it. It said, board members who take time to socialize at meetings or during annual retreats report feeling more like a collaborative team with a shared goal. Conversely, board members who don't structure time to connect with their fellow board members felt an obvious lack of collaboration. This is from a very huge study that Board Source has just released, and you can find it on the web if you haven't seen it yet. Well, what can you as individuals do to increase the feeling of partnership between the CEO and the board? One is, and also importantly, in relationship with other members of the board. One thing is an old term that they use on this, and it's, let me move okay, here we go, is what they call good and welfare. And some boards can take 10 minutes at the beginning of the meeting or at the end of the meeting to ask people on the board what they are doing in their other lives, either their personal lives or their professional lives. And this, I think, can be a very good tool to use to allow board members to go and know each other's, to better understand each other. For instance, on the board that I serve currently, there's one fellow who is obviously very talented, but rarely makes a statement. But I know he's a high achiever, and I'd like to know what he is doing in his professional life, so I could get to know him better. The Rotary clubs do a good job of that, but you can take part of that type of, you can do the same thing in about 10 minutes. Another thing I would suggest that the CEO and or board chairs meet individually with every board member. The CEO himself should meet individually with each board member once or twice a year. And at these meetings, it gives the CEO a chance to informally review new ideas and determine if the director finds his or her efforts meaningful. You also can use social occasions to get the staff and the management and other board members together. And I think this can be a difficult one because your board members live time-compressed lifestyle, but you need to make an effort to motivate board members to attend all the celebrations that the organizations have. Another thing is to connect to the CEO's work. For instance, involve some board members when you go to local or regional conferences. Take them with you. Ask them to come with you. I'm sure they would be willing. These are usually modest cost type of operations, and it gives them an idea of what's happening in the field. Because don't forget, they are far from your field, most likely in many cases here. So now and finally, one of the things you might do is to form what I call an alumni group of termed-out directors, people who have been directors in the past and have lost. Maybe you want them back and in constant contact with your organization for various reasons. I have an article out on that. That just came out in June. If you're interested in the details of forming an alumni organization, please send me an email at frameugene@gmail.com, and I will send you a copy of the article. There is broad interest in this because it's something that has been used in the business community with great success, and I think it can be used successfully in nonprofit organizations. All right. Another thing you can do is to attempt to energize your board meetings. And some of these things you can do or you have done or tried, but let me go down the list and see what have. Avoiding death by PowerPoints. PowerPoint presentations should not be more than 10 cells, okay? That is the content of it. For instance, the content portion of this presentation is only 9 cells, so you can get away with it. You need to keep minutia off the agenda. This is difficult but you can do that by questioning every item that goes on the agenda to say, to what extent does this issue have strategic impact for for us in somewhere? If you constantly ask that question, I think you will get better agendas. Another thing is the boilerplate things, the things that are often legal that everybody has to agree to. Put them at the beginning of the end, at the end of the meeting, or I think some of you can be successfully put them at the beginning of the meeting. Enliven staff reports. The CEO and board chair have an obligation to make sure they are presented within the time limits and the questions time is prescribed. Often the board gets so involved with the details, the interesting details of a particular function that it can take up the whole hour. I've seen that done. Another thing that you can think about, and I just list this here, is to use a consent agenda. And also conduct the meeting by Robert Rules of Order, and so and also make sure the CEO should make sure that every volunteer on the board feels that his or her work is meaningful. Now that will be a long range. That will have a long range to it. There are some people who feel that setting up the annual dinner dance is a meaningful activity, so you let them do that. On the other hand, you should have most boards who want to think about strategic activities and to drive the organization forward. So that would, in terms of meaningful work, it's critical to success of nonprofit boards is that the board members are looking and finding it of interest. Now, of course, just as a side issue, millennials are reporting to are an issue because they will work hard, but they are used to establishing their own schedules. So these are just lists that you can go down and take a look at and say, am I doing this? And maybe pick up some of the other things that other tips that I've picked up from my experience with other boards. Okay, now we're at the okay. Yeah. We now are, I guess time is flying, and Cindy, do you have any questions here?
We do have two if we want to do them quickly.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I know. I can see I'm running behind time. Yeah. So I know what to do. Okay.
Okay. So
I apologize, and I apologize for the late start again.
You're fine.
Okay.
So Donna's asking, can your finance committee be the audit committee? She's got limited board members.
Yes, but don't take the whole finance committee, okay? Take the 2 or 3 people off and have them serve as an audit committee. Traditionally, the idea of combining them is not well accepted, okay?
And one question from Edward, this is a quickie. How often should the board revisit their strategic plan?
Every 3 to 5 years now is the norm, okay? Because things change very fast, extremely fast, okay?
That's all for right now.
Okay, all right. Now we're on the third topic, is common practices. I'll go down this very fast. How much more time do I have, Cindy?
You've got 9 minutes.
9 minutes. All right. One is one of the things that need to be changed is dumbing down board recruitment. In other words, and I've emphasized this, going after people that you really want instead of taking what you have, going to friends, relatives, colleagues. Look for people with skills, strategic skills and things. Okay, the meeting attendance is a big issue, all right, because boards fail to enforce the bylaws. They don't want to hurt feelings. Of course, if you really want to work in this day and age, you want to have good technical support, because board members travel, but you need to have Skype, or you can use some of the other modern technologies. Google connections are there, or just even a speakerphone in the boardroom can be very helpful to many busy people. And because most of them these day and age are handling a lot of issues, conflicts between work, between outside activities, and their lifestyles there. So let's move on. Another type is where board actions are insufficient. Conflict of interest statements should be signed every year. Nothing. There are two major liabilities that nonprofits face that others don't face, and that is the Form 990 and the Intermediate Sanctions Act. If you're at a computer, take a look at Intermediate Sanctions Acts. It's IRS code 4958. You ought to make sure that that your D&O is covered for it and it's there. Obviously, management has to ask rigorous questions. Board has to ask rigorous questions of management. And finally, and I've hit this before, inefficient candidate vetting, okay, and a board acceptance there. Now, another one is allowing board members to be elected despite term limits. Succession planning is an issue for all nonprofits. A lot of them simply don't do it, and they need to do it. You also have to be concerned about time-consuming positions, such as audit or finance committee. Another thing is your give or get program. You need to make sure that all board members need to have considered it, but be careful how you handle it. One board chair that I encountered insisted that the donation for each of the board members should be the largest of their particular charitable donations. I happen to visit with every member of that board, and there was a lot of negative feedback. Why should he tell me who my largest contribution should be? And finally, allowing board members to ignore financial or other obligations that they may have, and I think you know that. As we go along, let me get to this. Come on. Is the overselling of the protection of D&O policies. You should review these policies because there has to be some protection. For Form 990, by the way, the IRS requires that the board be involved with every one of the annually with every one before it is submitted. Another major issue here is cybersecurity. You ought to make sure that you're protected for cybersecurity, and a lot of boards are, a lot of business boards that reports. I have a report here are not at that level. So cybersecurity policies should be reviewed. And let me just pass over that. I think you can get a feel for this, and so. I'd like to thank you for the interest, and I hope that you have found several new or corrective actions you can start to implement tomorrow. And so the last thing is my commercial. Okay, if you're interested, here is my blog site with 450 posts and counting, and also I have 2 books out, Going for Impact, which shows boards how to what are the issues related with impact, and Policy versus Paperclips. Most of you are very familiar with that. It's been out since 1988. And it's now in its 3rd edition at 2011. But that's a model for governance, and both books are reader friendly. Okay, Cindy, do you want to take some more questions?
Yep, we do have a question from Maria. It's a little long, but I'm going to read it all. I work in an organization where an operating group was brought in to achieve financial stability, and the principals are in leadership positions. This group's focus is meeting the goals they promised and to ensure their contract is renewed. However, they are ignoring key issues that face the organization, including complying with regulatory requirements. They filter information to the board and have now started replacing board members with cronies. How does one handle such a board?
Well, I don't know what position Marie is in on this, but you ought to at least, if you see things that are out of unusual things, you ought to report it to your immediate supervisor, or go higher if you, or go to a board member if you feel it's at that level. Of course, you're jeopardizing your job if you do this, but that's the only thing I can suggest. Okay.
Previously, you mentioned other financial obligations. I assume that meant specific to the board's responsibilities. Holly's looking for clarification as to what those other financial obligations might be.
Well, traditionally, the other financial obligations are to donate to the board annually, so the board can go to foundations and say, all of our board has financially contributed to our organization, understanding that there will be a very wide variance in a nonprofit board what they can afford, but even if it's a very modest amount, you need 100% participation, and that's an obligation.
Okay, one question came in from Randall. He wants to know, are there any regulations against the financial officer also serving on a nonprofit board?
You got to watch out for this. There can be. There was a case where a volunteer decided to become the CFO of the organization, and that it had financial problems, and it worked out that he wound up with I've forgotten the figure, a very strong financial, large financial liability, because he was the CFO.
All right, question from Chris. Have you ever experienced any staff against board situations, and how have you handled this?
Will you come again on that? I didn't pick that up. Go ahead.
Chris wants to know, have you ever experienced a staff against the board type situation, and how would you have handled it if you have?
Well, I have, but it was handled poorly, and you pay attention to it, and you might bring a moderator in, a third party, and to talk to staff and to talk to board to see what the links of commonality are. I would do that at a very early stage. The one that I was involved with, the board had hired a new ED who turned out to be very authoritarian, and they wanted to give him a chance to pull things together, but the staff just revolted, and so and actually joined a union. So because the board didn't pay attention early on.
All right, last question. Edward is asking, is there an ideal number of board members, and if so, how many is the right number?
It depends on your organization. You might get as few as 6, 7, or 8, or you might get somewhere in the 20s. So it depends on the organization, on the representation that's needed. And so it's very situational.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Fram. That is all the time. Thank you again for everyone's patience at the top of the hour. If you have any further questions, please email them to ritalum@rit.edu, and we can get those over to Jean on your behalf. Thanks again, Jean, for being our presenter. Thanks to all of our attendees here with us today. Our next webinar is in 2 weeks from tomorrow, and join us where we will cover the world of credit card processing and the cybersecurity and how to prevent your fraud and identity theft and all that good stuff with alumnus Pete Beckery. So thanks again to everyone for being here. Please exit by closing your WebEx window. And there is a brief survey. It's optional, but let us know what you thought of today's webinar. Thank you so much to everyone, and have a great day.